which is very interesting because you don't see that very frequently across Native American tribes.
Well, weren't the descriptions of that religion somewhat interesting to you?
There are a bunch of different descriptions of the religion. I don't want to say anything about it without being able to revisit it first.
Okay, fair.
But yeah, it's very interesting how structured their society was when you consider that Hernan de Soto talks about this, and he's definitely describing a decline. But he talks about these things existing in the 1540s. When the British get here in the 1580s, it's gone.
Well, not to mention, sort of the time is the time they're arriving at the East Coast, because the British didn't do stuff around the Gulf because they couldn't intervene.
Yeah, oh no, for sure. It's just like by the time the British got 45 years.
Yep.
Within 45 years, this entire culture's gone.
The closest one that probably would have been able to give it any kind of arguable description of it disappearing would be the French. But even then,
The French weren't there yet.
No, because their settlement for Louisiana wasn't really coming about for another. They came about in the early 1600s, didn't they?
I think late 1600s.
The late 1600s.
I believe so. The French get there, and that's the really interesting thing. The French get there, and they encounter the Natchez,
Who were?
who were a Native American group who are a linguistic isolate.
Oh no, you
They
were
are
right.
one of 5 linguistic isolates centered around the Gulf of Mexico, specifically Louisiana.
So if you're describing this from the mid to early 1500s, then the French
Yeah.
were settled Louisiana in 1699.
Yep. Yeah.
Literally the very end. So that's
150 years, and the French get there 150 years later, and what they see is they're like, okay, well these are not structured tribes. These are not chiefdoms. These are tribal organizations, and they exploit that to hell.
And if you want to consider generations, that's talking about what could be very easily lost over that time. That's about 6 generations, 7 generations.
If you assume a lifespan of 50 years, it's 3 people ago.
But even then, even talking about generations for what people remember
Mm-hmm.
in the first place.
And Native Americans typically live to be very old. Like, Native Americans who lived past infancy, a lot of the time, if you were not killed by a person or an animal, sickness was so rarely a problem until the Europeans got here that the Native Americans would, on average, live into their 80s and 90s.
Do we know why that was the case?
Why was the case?
Why sickness wasn't a problem until
Hunter
Europeans
gatherers
got
also had the same thing in general across, like way healthier diets, like varied diets, physical activity. Leading that kind of lifestyle is actually very healthy for the body. It is.
What today kills most people?
Not being at like
Heart disease,
Yeah.
cancer, sickness, generally things that are increased by our environment and our choices.
lack of nutrition and exercise.
And if you look over at Europe, it wasn't that Europeans were getting sick more frequently because they weren't bathing. It was that Europeans got sick more frequently because they lived in close quarters, because they lived in cities, and they were highly agricultural. The Native Americans, for the most part, were semi-nomadic. They would have small farming settlements, so you'd have fewer people in a given area. They also had the ability to quarantine a little bit more easily if they got sick. The average Native American man knew how to hunt and trap and, gather and fish and do all of those things that your average European at that point, because you live in a highly specialized society where the average person isn't going to be a hunter, they're going to be a cobbler or a tissue needler. So, because you have different scales of civilization, Europeans got sick more frequently. It wasn't a cleanliness issue, but it did happen more frequently, so Europeans died younger. Native Americans didn't get sick as frequently. When they did get sick, they often recovered. And there had been no contact between East and West, aside from a minuscule amount with the cleanest people in Europe in around 1000 AD, that being the Vikings. You have that minuscule contact, but other than that, there's no contact between the outside world and the Americas. So they were immune to all of their diseases, just like Europeans were immune to all of their diseases. But Europeans spread disease more quickly. Yep. It wasn't on purpose. There was one time that it was on purpose. One time that it was on purpose, and it didn't work, and he did it outside of his chain of command.
Do you want to elaborate on that real quick?
The smallpox blankets thing was actually Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that happened. Fort Pitt, and I can't remember the guy's name, but basically he was they had a smallpox outbreak in Fort Pitt while they were under siege by a Native American tribe, and it got to be winter, and he was like, I know how we can end this. I'm going to take the blankets from our smallpox patients, and I'm going to have them wrapped up and given as gifts to the Native Americans. That way they'll all start to get sick, and then we can break the siege. But what happened instead is that they gave a bunch of blankets to Native Americans who were very cold and didn't realize that smallpox cannot survive outside of the body for more than like a couple of hours. So by the time the blankets actually got to the Native Americans, it was completely inert. I think it was the Shawnee.
Now, see, here's the question.
Like, horrible intentions.
How did they accept the gifts, and how did that affect the outcome of the siege?
It didn't.
Oh, so they took the gifts but continued to siege?
Oh, yeah. Interesting. To be clear, humanitarian efforts between warring sides were more frequent than is historically believed. Not all the time, not even most of the time, but it did happen that you'd have one side be like, well, you know what, we're trying to be honorable about this whole thing.
Yeah, there's
like,
a number of cases of people basically stopping the fighting on, hey guys, so we're gonna stop this. We're just gonna go meet out here and gather our dead and other stuff. We just need to go take care of it. Usually, it was over rights of the dead.
Yeah.
Because there was this idea, oftentimes an idea of what will happen to your body will affect you in the afterlife. And while there were things that were done specifically to desecrate the enemy, yes, that is something that was done, but oftentimes it was not done out of fear of, oh, if we do this to them, they're going to do it to us, and I don't want to damn our own people to hell.
And so, unless you're that one guy during the Albigensian Crusade.
Like God sort them out.
Yeah. Kill them all, God will recognize his own.
Woof.
Yeah, I think it was the Siege of Brazier.
God, just the fact that a lot of people don't understand this, is that when we talk about the Crusades, everyone looks at the Middle East, right? Everyone thinks you're going to Jerusalem, or Constantinople.
No, bitch, you're going to France.
But no, yeah, a lot of the Crusades for the early day and age was specifically within Europe.
Yep.
It was in France. It was in Germany, heading into Poland. It was in Spain. Those were crusades.
Question ready? I have a great question for the group. Which crusade would you most like to have taken part in?
The second.
You picked, like, the worst one. You picked objectively one of the worst crusades.
Tell me why.
Because they went over there and they were like, we must liberate Jerusalem, which hadn't been captured yet. Actually, they went, we must liberate Odessa. And then they got over almost to Odessa, and they were like, it's kind of far, let's take Damascus instead. The problem was that Damascus was allied with them. So, they got all the way out there. I think it was King Philip II of France, and a German? Was it Conrad? Conrad the Third Crusade. Conrad's the Third Crusade.
Not the second. That's there, right?
No, I'm thinking of the second right now.
Am I thinking the Archduke of Austria?
Yeah, I think I got one of the characters wrong here. I think it was Philip II of France was one of the kings involved, and the other king, I believe, was German. But the crusade itself completely fell flat. They attacked their ally and did not actually rescue Odessa. Or Edessa.
And it wasn't until the Third Crusade, because the third one is with Richard the Lionheart.
Yeah.
And that whole thing succeeds. I would definitely do the Third Crusade by that logic.
Succeeds.
No, it succeeds because it succeeds diplomacy, and they end up not actually having to really
The
fight.
Catholic Church.
Oh, nice.
So the Catholic Church did not consider it a success, but strategically, it was a success. He did gain the rights for people to go on pilgrimages to Jerusalem and for Christians to live there. Just he didn't retake the city.
Would you
I think
consider...
he leased it for 10 years.
Yeah. It was what the one that was proper diplomacy, I think, where they actually did take it was, or not take it, it was the Sixth Crusade, I think it was.
I think so.
How many were there? 8.
Well, I mean, yeah, there's a bunch in the Middle East, and if you want to just ask the question, how many crusades were there, really the answer is we don't know.
Well, I mean, because there's a lot of different movements, and people will count different things. Like, there's the official crusades, and then there's the minor ones that people just did. Like, the Children's Crusade. Was that a crusade? Well,
It was a tragedy, is what it was.
Oh, dear God.
Children's Crusade was a monk being like, I know how we'll liberate Jerusalem, I'll lead an army of children, and they all got enslaved.
Yeah.
All of them.
Did we technically did an episode on the Crusades, but I don't think we did enough.
On our channel?
Yeah.
Oh, ages ago. There was like a 20-minute episode.
Yeah. So a full episode here on each crusade.
Each crusade.
Yeah, this is the other one. This is the third. The second was, I think it was the really big insult. The third crusade, Barbarossa. Yeah, the sixth crusade, right? The sixth crusade was Frederick, with the Holy Roman Empire. And the thing about this is that he was an individual that the Catholic Church had a very on and off again spicy relationship with. They hated each other, but they needed each other.
We're really big fans of, I think, Louis VI.
Mm-hmm. So Frederick, if I recall, I need to go back. I did a whole series. I did like an actual 8-part series on the Crusades for the history of everything. I don't remember if he gets excommunicated first, but he gets disavowed by the Catholic Church, and yet he still goes anyway and succeeds basically on his own, and through diplomacy takes Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they get it. It was the Sixth Crusade from 1228 to 1229, also known as the Crusade of Frederick II. Like, literally known as his crusade because he personally did it, where everything, because the Fifth Crusade was a nightmare. It failed horribly.
That was the one where they tried to go through a canyon to get to Cairo, right?
Because they were trying to take Egypt, and it was...
They forgot that the one advantage they had over the Saracens was their heavy cavalry, and they went on a route where their heavy cavalry couldn't operate because they were in a canyon. So I was gonna say the Crusades in Spain, because I feel like of all of the Crusades, that would be the comfiest.
Like temperature-wise,
It's very temperate, good food.
Yeah, but Spain was brutal back and forth over the course of 400 years.
Yeah, lots of fighting to be done.
I mean, yeah.
so he's looking forward to the fighting.
I mean, I'm looking forward to the fighting.
Well, one of the key
Don't
reasons...
don't send me where the battle's hottest. Send me where the battle's hardest.
So it's actually after the ending failures of the Crusades.
This is actually very sharp.
Yeah, no, it is. It definitely is. That's real. It was after the failures of the Crusades, like after the last Crusade had failed, that what they did is that's where efforts were then switched over to areas within Europe. So instead of trying to retake the Holy Land, all the disparate knights and holy orders and everything refocused their efforts on specifically taking out the Muslim entities, to clear things out of Italy, to clear things out of Spain, to move into the east and take out the Lithuanians and remove the last...
To be fair, I think that one would have been the most fun.
With the Templar Order?
Like, the actual fighting part, because there's just no competition there.
Oh, yeah.
But, like, it would be so cold. You know, that's the thing. It's like, the Crusades against the Lithuanians were too cold. The Crusades against the Saracens were too hot. But, much like Goldilocks and the Third Bowl of Pork, the Crusades in Spain are just right.
Or, hear me out on this, the ones in southern France, because at that point we're taking out French.
Ooh! But yeah, the Albigensian Crusade is just kind of a genocide.
Oh no, it's a horrible thing in the
That's
first place.
just a genocide.
Because also at that point, we're not talking about, they're not even French. Yeah, because people misconstrue the fact that they think, like, oh, it's in France, they're French. No, they were Occitan, I believe, is what it would be.
Yeah, somebody actually tried to argue with me about this recently because somebody posted that Catholics never committed any genocides. Like, first of all, that's not true for a whole bunch of reasons, but I'm going to give you the white people example just to be clear on this one. And I was like, the Albigensian Crusade can't really be described as anything else. And I left out the Occitan part entirely because targeting a religious group for extermination fits the definition of genocide.
Yes, it does.
And like, they did, and then the response was, well, by that definition, then the Reconquista was also a genocide. And I was like, well, I guess technically then Catholics have committed at least 2 genocides.
If you want to bring up the argument, especially for what it is that they did afterwards.
Yeah, I would say the Reconquista was not an intentional genocide. It was more a Reconquista.
And explain exactly what the Reconquista was.
Well, so the Romans conquered. So as far back as we can go, there's a bunch of people called Celtiberians, and we're not sure how Celtic they were as opposed to being Iberian. If the differences were due to Celtic culture spreading into Iberia, but not Celtic ethnicity spreading into Iberia, or if Celtiberian was just kind of a variant established a presence in the West. But those are the people that are there when the Greeks and the Carthaginians get there, the Celtiberians.
Yes.
They are generally Celtic in culture and in language. Also, a group of them will, around 600 BC, split off and go north up the coast and become the Irish, who are not the same people as the Britons. These are two completely different Celtic groups that lived across the sea from one another. But the Romans get there, they conquer what the Greeks and the Carthaginians hadn't, establish supremacy over the entire area, and it becomes Romanized. It's one of the first European provinces to become fully under the control of Rome. This is before Gaul, this is before Britain, and this is before Germany. So Spain was really the first area west of Rome conquered by Rome.
Specifically because of the Punic Wars.
Yeah, because they were fighting the Carthaginians, so they were already there. It's also where they developed a lot of the changes that would come to the legions and the way that they fought.
Roman military structure, their weapons, a lot of it was based off specifically the Iberian blades.
They took a lot of stuff from the Iberians. So, that becomes very Roman. And then when Rome becomes Christian, that becomes very Christian. And it's one of the most ancient Latin communities in Europe outside of Italy. So then, around 700 AD, a silly little thing happens where Islam just swipes across North Africa.
Oh, you skipped the whole thing with
right, I forgot about the Vandals.
The migratory people
Vandals and Visigoths.
Western Rome. The entirety of Spain is like Rome loses it and it gets taken over by the Vandals.
I can't believe I forgot about the Vandals.
And the Vandals were
the Vandals and Visigoths were both Germanic tribes.
So remember the Huns?
Yes.
Driving people out? The Vandals were one of the groups that the Huns drove out.
Yeah.
So the Vandals went from like Eastern Europe basically in the steppes and they crossed all the way across Europe to then invade Spain. They were pushed. And they just kept going.
Oh, and they kept going past Spain. They get to Spain, they go through Spain, they go into North Africa, and they end up in Tunisia. There for a while there, Tunisia was ruled by white Germans.
wow.
Yeah. So, and then following the Vandals are the Visigoths, and the Ostrogoths go into Greece and Italy, and the Visigoths go into Spain. They're not the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths until that happens. They're just the Goths, and then they separate. You get the Visigoths who go into Africa or into Spain. They take over most of Spain, and then around the 700s come, and Muhammad's like, what if Islam was everywhere? And his successors were like, that sounds like a great plan, boss. So they just sweep westward across North Africa, and then they cross into the Straits of Gibraltar.
Over a span of like 40 years.
Yeah, this all happens really quickly.
Really fast.
It's extremely violent. They get there, they conquer most of Iberia, except for a teensy sliver. There's
Asturias.
you know how there's those mountains, the Pyrenees?
Yeah.
So the Islamic armies are like, I don't need to cross those. What's the worst that can happen if we leave a tiny Christian kingdom on our good Muslim area, on our good Muslim peninsula? And the worst thing that can happen is genocide 500 years later. Not 500, 700 years later. Yeah, because Asturias took that personally, and then slowly they start to expand. Because actually the Muslims didn't really just stop. They might have taken Asturias if not for Charles Martel.
Yeah, because they tried, and then it was specifically Charles Martel the Hammer because they left Asturias and were like, that land is not really valuable. You know what is valuable?
France.
Southern France. And that's where they launched a jihadist expansionist effort into taking southern France. And
By the way, Tours is not that south.
No, like
Tours is up there.
The southern half of France.
I know. That's what I'm saying. They took like half of France.
Like a good percentage of Europe could have been Muslim in its history there because of specifically what happened.
It is, but it's not covering you at all. I saw that a while ago. Yeah.
It's gonna be really funny.
Yeah. It's like an over-the-shoulder shot. Wow.
Yeah, but so they do get up into France. They get to Tours, and Charles Martel is like, absolutely not, because for the first time they have to face knights. Like, they're not quite. These aren't the knights you'd expect.
These are the proto-knights.
These aren't the plate armor, chainmail everywhere knights of 1066 and onwards, but they're still heavily armored. Their horses are armored. They have lances that are just absurdly long and thick, And on top of that, they have very heavy infantry who really like fighting with throwing axes. And they hit that, and it is like a brick wall. They just get crushed. They then retreat south, and they go, you know what? We're just gonna that little spot where the peninsula hits the rest of Europe. That we're leaving that alone, and we're gonna chill here in Iberia. And I can't imagine that tiny kingdom in the northwestern corner is gonna do much.
And then they consolidate, and then simultaneously, and I say consolidate, they then begin to break apart into separate little emirates that are constantly fighting one another. Because you had a first division between it was the Ayyubid, I think was the original. It was the Ayyubid Caliphate, and then this split off, and you had the Ayyubid and the Umayyad.
Yeah, I think the Umayyad was the eastern, the Ayyubid was the western. Yeah, I think, right?
No, Abbasid.
Abbasid.
It was the Abbasid was in the because Ayyubid was Saladin. That was hundreds of years later.
Yeah,
that's my.
I was like, that doesn't sound right.
that was the Ayyubid was under Saladin, if I recall correctly. So it was the Abbasid is.
I think the Abbasid was the eastern one.
Yes.
The Umayyad was the western.
And ironically, the Umayyad that controlled Spain, they're the original big one because it was the Rashidun Caliphate. That was under Muhammad, and then.
And his direct successor.
Yes, and then what followed after them was the Umayyad, but then due to a very complicated thing that happens in Islamic history called stabbing each other in the back, the Abbasid took everything over, and the Umayyad basically fled east, fled west. And when they fled west, the Umayyad is what then controlled Spain. And so there was this division, similar to because the idea behind the caliphates is that there can't be multiple caliphates. There is just the caliphate. So,
because the caliph is Muhammad's successor.
So, in a similar situation to someone being the successor of Rome, like who is the real Rome between East and West, the Byzantines and the Holy Roman Empire, etc.
Wales.
The Muslims had the exact same thing with the Abbasid and the Umayyad Caliphate. And the Umayyad Caliphate, though very strong in Spain, over the course of the next couple hundred years, would begin to gradually break down into a decentralized system of multiple emirates that would be fighting with one another. And because they were fighting with one another, some of them would end up teaming up with the Christians in order to fight other Muslims, which gradually led to a breakdown as the Christian forces gradually spread south. This is what then led to the creation of not Asturias, but the kingdom of Galicia, Castile, Leon, Aragon, and more.
And that time period of that was...
That's basically...
From that time, you're talking about from...
Around the 1000 AD is when that starts.
It's about
I think Charlemagne is the first one to really start making pushes, but they don't succeed.
No, but that also happened because, and similar to the whole thing for the alliance with the Christians, the emir of Barcelona, he made an alliance with Charlemagne to drive out the other Muslims and promised that he would, I think he promised that he would convert to Christianity, but I don't remember if that is exactly the case. Basically, he promised that he would
He did promise, he didn't do it.
He promised that he would become a client, essentially, of Charlemagne. Then he becomes subservient as a vassal. So, Charlemagne comes down, they beat the Muslims in the south, and then when it comes time for him to swear allegiance, the Emir of Barcelona is just like, no, I'm not going to do that. No, why the fuck would I do that? And then that ends with other fighting. But at that point, Charlemagne, even though he fought him, he was never able to secure a foothold into Spain, specifically because this is right around the time that the Saxons were getting a little bit uppity, and he had to go on a little bit of a murder genocide there and burn down all their holy sites. Which he did.
He did do that. Don't get uppity.
Yeah?
Those uppity Saxons.
It'd be a good recommendation for most leaders throughout history.
The best part of it, though, is that, everybody thinks about the Crusades, and they're like, oh my god, 200 years of war. It was really more like 20 years of war across 200 years.
Yeah. Just like the 100 Years' War.
Yeah, I mean, the Crusades were a long time period, but most of it was peace. So when the Templars and the Hospitallers, who were military orders, who still needed money to operate, because they still needed to buy themselves food and weapons and armor and things like that, just in case, just in case something happened. once in a while it did, and then they had to go do something. But in order to make money, they would go and fight for Christian kings in Spain.
Yep.
Which meant that frequently they were fighting Islamic kings in Spain, but sometimes they were also fighting each other. The Hospitallers and the Templars, despite being the two most famous, largest Christian military orders of all time, hated each other's guts. They had completely different missions. One was literally founded to care for the sick and the wounded. The other was founded to protect pilgrims on the road. So they weren't supposed to cross over each other's territory. But once they started operating as mercenary companies, they started competing with one
That's
another.
gonna happen then, yeah.
And one of the reasons that the Battle of Acre, in I think it's 1200 AD, I would say, one of the reasons that battle is so interesting is because the conquest by the Saracens was so violent that the Hospitallers and the Templars ended up teaming up to defend Acre to their last moments so that the civilians could escape.
Wow.
Yeah, so basically these two sides who hated each other for nearly 200 years straight.
Nobody's doing anything.
They've seen the mentality of how this war has been going. They know they're not going to win, but there is a hard war, and there are ships leaving home, and they hold the line as long as they can to allow people to escape. And then you hear what happened to those who didn't escape that battle, and the series was one of the things was brutal. Men, women, children, all raped, murdered, literally sites looted, desecrated. It's brutal. It's brutal stuff.
And at that point, we're talking about these late 90s. That's the end of the Crusades. And from there, that is where a lot of the pushes to then have other Crusades in other parts of Europe. The 1300s is when the whole thing would happen. Now, the whole thing that became on the Templars' race, that's what they just thought. The Templars, what was like known as Hospitallers, were like, there's some pagans to kill. And so they released and they just went over to essentially consolidate the Roman Empire. And that's where, around that time, in the 1300s, a lot of Spain had, it was basically divided into a series of Christian kingdoms and a series of kingdoms. And so it was just a constant back and forth. There were regions where the East were infiltrating and even intermarrying, which was a big thing that happened there. So describe the whole thing as just imagine a context of what just one region in Spain.
That's why you can't really describe it as a genocide. It's because it's already happened. It's already created. The only part where it gets to when we can say genocide is actually after things were consolidated. And once everything had taken over, it was once Spain, because it was technically Spain at that point, it was a union of Castile and Aragon, became Spain and Portugal on one side. Yes, but in this case, Castile and Aragon, it was king and queen who decided afterwards of, alright, we take everything over. I don't trust that these people actually convert to Christianity because there was a foundation they had to prepare. You had to either convert or leave the country. And that happens 30, 40, 50 years prior to this. It was a wonderful generation of time. And then, as you're in the mass converts, I mean, for me, a lot of people are just the mass convert. There is truth to the fact that many people did not actually convert. They secretly continued to practice either Judaism or Islam. So, what the monarchy decided at that point was, we want money, and we don't want these people from this land anymore. So anyone that converted in this time, and anyone that remains that has not converted, we're just going to kick out of Spain. And so they're not exactly mass killing people or raids on people going around and terrorizing Muslim communities and Jewish communities more, and then burning their places down and driving them out of the country. This is also very disingenuous to use as an example of Jews being kicked out of 109 countries. Because, yes, the Jews were kicked out of Spain, but it wasn't just the Jews, and it wasn't
renaissance of literature, which arose out of both Italy and Constantinople, which from that is one of the theories behind the birth of the Renaissance. Because all of these learned men from different parts of Spain suddenly were coalesced into one area.
Huh.
Yep. Into a time where it was already kind of happening, but if anything, it's like almost giving someone a shot of caffeine to kind of boost things along.
Wow.
It's European history, man.
It's a lot more than it
It's a lot more complicated than the England and France bickering that you usually hear.
Yeah.
The England and France bickering part is fun, don't get me wrong, but the rest of the stuff is fun.
That's
And
good.
I mean, Harold Cardona alone is one of my favorite figures.
Just did it.
And here's the thing: the reason I didn't use Harold Cardona as my badass fantasy is because I don't
soon as those motorcycles pulled up to the trail above the mountain, he saw one of the windows of the fire truck light shattered. Awful smell was coming from inside. Looking into the trailer, the motorcycle stood beside the stack. Outside the back of the window were the empty ration cans. Unloading the trailer, he saw a pair of tennis shoes lying next to the back of the horse, and lying wrapped in the latex on top of the fence. As he heard the body, he called it in, and the Park Service and the police came to search the area immediately. The body that was found on top of the bed was in horrible condition. For one, it was wrapped in blankets in an almost mummified state. The blankets were heavy enough to have bound the body's head. When the blankets were removed, this revealed that the face was completely blocked off. While the body was in a awfully condition, they could tell that the feet were especially bad off. The socks and shoes had been removed, and it appeared that the foot had been frosted gave this. So much so that the body was missing 5 toes. However, one thing the police did recognize is the clothing of the body was the last known clothing of someone that they had been looking for. And as confirmed by the reporters of the court, his wallet that was laying on the nightstand next to him, this was the body of Ted Wayne. It seemed that at some point in the last several months, Ted wound up in that trailer and succumbed to injuries sustained out in the snow behind on the cause of death was ruled to be a pulmonary edema resulting in pneumonia. Now, this raises a lot of questions, so let's get the big ones out of the way first. Ted's body was found with the sheets wrapped around him in a condition that doesn't make sense for Ted to do to himself. Being found by food gradually represents how large a raft had in the same way. And not to mention that, remember the tennis shoes that were lying next to the door? Those weren't Ted's shoes. They were later identified as being Gary Mathias's shoes. Ted's shoes, or at least the ones that he was seen wearing the night of his disappearance, his brown linen boots, were nowhere found. Furthermore, the trailer wasn't in the structure at this location. Just outside of the trailer, there were 2 sheds containing survival implements. In one shed was a poorly used supply of food, and in the other shed was
says that to get out of the boys would have had to have taken the exit to get going park. At Brownsville, there was a location known as Mary's Country Store. She said that whenever she pulled up to Mary's to start her shift, that she got out of her vehicle, and sitting in the vehicle next to her were two guys who she thought might be mentally handicapped. She said this was because they had